All right, so welcome back to the Young Idealist, my ongoing series on classical German philosophy. And today we have a very special episode, an episode on a thinker of post-Kantian philosophy that has been often neglected, and is a very important thinker, actually. And to discuss this thinker with me, I have Dr. James Messina, who is a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Messina's research deals with issues in Kant's mature theoretical philosophy, such as his views on space, laws of nature, philosophical methodology, modality, and the role of the understanding in perception. He also works on earlier German philosophers who had a strong influence on Kant, such as Leibniz, Wolff, Crucius, and later German philosophers who were strongly influenced by Kant, such as Reinhold Schulze, which is why you're here today, Fichte, and Hegel. His recent publications include Kant's stance on rationalist substantivalist debate and its justification, Journal of the History of Philosophy in 2018, Kant's necessitation, an account of laws and the nature of natures, which is, I think, in a series, right? Kant and the Laws of Nature in 2017, edited by Michela Massimi and Angela Breitenbach, as well as the relationship between space and mutual interaction, Kant contra Newton and Leibniz in the Canadian Journal of Philosophy. As Dr. Messina is currently working on a book tentatively entitled Kant and the Metaphysics of Space, Nature, and God. The book offers a new reading of the content and development and justification of Kant's surprisingly sophisticated metaphysics of space. So welcome, Dr. Messina, and thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm excited to talk about Schulze.
So the reason why I've invited you here, or invited you to speak here today, is to speak about an important thinker who has sadly been neglected, except for certain thinkers like Frederick Weiser, who has really nice text that, brings him into the historical apparatus. So hopefully this episode can act as a remedy for this canonical neglect. So perhaps you can begin by introducing who Schulze was and why do you think his philosophy is important for the tradition of German idealism and post-Kantian thought?
Sure. So Gottlob Ernst Schulze was a philosophy professor and a proponent of skepticism. The work that he's most known for was anonymously published in 1792. This is it. We'll call it for short the Aenesidemus. This is a German edition of it, edited by Manfred Frank. There's a partial translation of it in this nice volume by Giovanni and Harris. So this work has a very long title. It's called the Aenesidemus, or Concerning the Foundations of the Philosophy of the Elements, issued by Professor Reinhold in Jena, together with a defense of skepticism against the pretensions of the critique of reason. So yeah, very long title. I'll just call it the Aenesidemus. So this takes the form of a series of letters between someone named Hermias, who has read Kant and Reinhold and has converted to the critical philosophy and is very excited about it. And he's writing to someone named Aenesidemus, who is not convinced about the critical philosophy in Reinhold. So Schulze, in the person of this Aenesidemus, levels a barrage of criticisms against Kant's philosophy and also against Karl Reinhold's attempt to turn Kant's philosophy into a systematic science based on a first principle. This Aenesidemus is, of course, the name of an ancient Pyrrhonian skeptic. So in terms of the influence of this work, I think it had a major and multi-sided influence on the course of German philosophy. It was famously influential for the development of Johann Gottlieb Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre. So Fichte had been a convert to Kant and to Reinhold, but then he reads the Aenesidemus, and he's completely shaken to his core, and all of a sudden starts to doubt critical philosophy. He doubts the sort of Reinholdian system that he had been developing. Fichte says, quote, "Aenesidemus has overthrown Reinhold in my eyes, has made me suspicious of Kant, and has overturned my whole system from the ground up. One cannot live under the open sky. It cannot be helped. The system must be rebuilt." Fichte ended up writing a review of the Aenesidemus that was published in 1794. And if you read the review, which is also translation of which is in this great volume here, you can see that Fichte didn't abandon the project of trying to systematize the critical philosophy and derive it from a highest principle. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had these works like the foundations of the entire Wissenschaftslehre. But you can see from the review that Schulze has made him see that Reinhold's chosen first principle is not up to the job. So Fichte praises Schulze in various works, including the foundations of the Wissenschaftslehre. So that's one way in which the Aenesidemus was influential for the course of German idealism. It was also an influence on Solomon Maimon, who wrote his own series of fictional letters with a character named Aenesidemus, and who tried to answer Aenesidemus's various doubts. And the Aenesidemus was also influential in another way on folks who were skeptical of the attempt to turn the critical philosophy into a systematic science, and who were more generally skeptical of attempts to try to turn philosophy into a science. So this includes the early romantics and fellow travelers. They thought that Schulze in the Aenesidemus had revealed the impossibility of any systematic philosophy from first principles. So pretty important work, pretty important that we're talking about it today.
Yeah, and I think he did a really great job of introducing who Schulze is and his importance to the history of classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought as well. So thank you very much for that very nice answer. Could you give a brief biography on Schulze's life? Now, it doesn't have to be exhaustive, maybe just the main events, perhaps summarizing kind of the
Sure.
yeah, the main events of his life, in a sense.
Yep. So we don't know a whole ton about his biography, but we know some things. He was born in 1761 and died in 1833. He attended the University of Wittenberg, where he studied theology, logic, and metaphysics. At the University of Wittenberg, he wrote his 2 dissertations on themes in ancient philosophy. So from very early on, he was interested in ancient philosophy. He got his initial appointment as a professor at Helmstedt University. He worked there for about 20 years. In 1810, he joined the University of Göttingen, and there he had a very famous student by the name of Arthur Schopenhauer. And apparently it was Schulze who convinced Schopenhauer to turn himself to philosophy. And it was also Schulze who told Schopenhauer that it would be best if Schopenhauer first cut his teeth learning about Plato and Kant and really mastering them before Schopenhauer turned to other kinds of figures. And so, by the way, going back to the question about influence from earlier, it seems plausible that Schulze's ideas had an influence on Schopenhauer's own thinking, even though Schopenhauer sometimes says snarky things about Schulze. So a theme that we find in both Schopenhauer and Schulze is that it's illegitimate to apply the concept of causation to the thing in itself, to apply the principle of sufficient reason to the thing in itself. By the way, I also think that there are echoes of Schulze's ideas, even in the thought of Friedrich Nietzsche, and they might have gotten there probably did get there by way of Schopenhauer. So I'm thinking, for example, of this nice passage in Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, where he's making fun of these German idealists for positing this faculty to explain synthetic a priori judgments, and how kind of vast it is think that lacking faculties, it explains anything. That exact sentiment is found in Schulze. Schulze wrote many more works than just the Aenesidemus. He published a number of books and philosophical reviews of other works. One book of his, called The Critique of Theoretical Philosophy, published in 1801, ended up influencing Hegel in something like the way that the Aenesidemus influenced Fichte. So Hegel ended up writing a review of The Critique of Theoretical Philosophy, and it was an occasion for him to sort of clarify the nature of skepticism and the role that skepticism ought to play in philosophy. Hegel was a lot meaner to Schulze in his review than Fichte was in his review.
That's great. Thank you. It's really interesting about the connections with Hegel, but also Nietzsche. That's really interesting. I didn't actually know that. I always thought that attack on the faculty of the synthetic a priori was just shots at was just Nietzsche's own kind of shots at Kant. But it's really interesting to see maybe the influence of Schulze there. So that's really great. In your opinion, in your judgment, who do you think are Schulze's philosophical influences, and how do these influences get employed throughout his philosophical work?
Yeah, good. So I think given the title of the work, the Aenesidemus, it's clear that Pyrrhonian skepticism is one major influence on Schulze's thought. And one place where we see the influence of Pyrrhonian skepticism is in the way that Schulze refuses to be dogmatic. So even towards the beginning of the work, he wants to say that he doesn't even want to be dogmatic, that his criticisms of Kant and Reinhold are valid. He thinks even there it's very possible that he's made a mistake and he wants to be corrected by people. Like Aenesidemus, so Aenesidemus had raised challenge about the concept of cause and whether it can be used to gain knowledge of objective reality. That's a huge theme in Schulze's work. And like the historical Aenesidemus, Schulze is raising challenges to our ability to infer from the quality of our representations to the nature of the reality outside of our representations. So that's an influence, Aenesidemus, Pyrrhonian skepticism. Another figure that is constantly being talked about in the work is, of course, Hume. Kant famously claimed that he was answering Hume, that Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumber, and Aenesidemus / Schulze really wants to check whether that's actually true. Has he actually delivered a satisfying response to Humean skepticism? Schulze seems to read Hume himself as a kind of Pyrrhonian skeptic, and he argues at length that Kant hasn't really answered Hume's doubts about the legitimacy of the causal principle, the principle that says every event or everything must have a cause. So we've got so far Aenesidemus / Pyrrhonian skepticism, Hume as an influence. I think another likely influence on Schulze is Friedrich Jacobi. So Jacobi had famously leveled this objection to Kant that Kant's invocation of the thing in itself and the idea of the thing in itself affecting us or causing us to have sensations runs counter to critical strictures and is a use of the category of causation that goes beyond the boundaries of possible experience. I see Schulze as sort of building on that Jacobi criticism in various ways. And then just to cite one more influence, Schulze's father-in-law was J.G. Fichte. And one thing that Schulze says in the Aenesidemus is that, in critiquing Kant, he's not going to look in detail at, for instance, the arguments that Kant gives for space being a form of intuition, because he thinks that those have already been sort of shown to be fallacious arguments, and it seems like he's thinking of people like Fichte here, who had already critiqued these aspects of Kant's argument. So we've got, at least 4 influences on this philosophical work.
That's great that you brought in. He seems like a very eclectic thinker. He has a lot of,
Yes, he is.
interesting thought, Pyrrhonians as well as, Jacobi as well. And Jacobi is another philosopher that's also featured in my series. So I'm glad you brought that up. Why did Schulze think that Kant's Critique of Pure Reason did disprove Hume's skepticism about induction? And what are some of Schulze's criticisms? It's so nice that you brought this up. So as your last kind of point, so it meshes well with the discussion.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think to understand Schulze's criticism of Kant's attempt to defend the causal principle against Hume, we have to sort of understand the kind of idiosyncratic way that Schulze reconstructs Kant's reasoning.
All right.
So the causal principle for Kant, every event has a cause, is a synthetic a priori judgment. Now, this is how Schulze understands Kant's attempt to defend the legitimacy of this causal principle. So Kant argues, according to Schulze, that this causal principle, which is a synthetic a priori judgment, is justified because it, like anything else, has to have a cause. And the only thing that could cause synthetic a priori judgments is an a priori faculty of our mind, a faculty of our mind that causes this judgment as a condition of the possibility of experience. And because this judgment is a condition of the possibility of experience and comes from our mind and its a priori faculties, the judgment, the synthetic a priori judgment, everything has a cause, is a priori valid. And so it can be known prior to experience. And because the causal principle, which is synthetic a priori, has its origin in a faculty of our mind that makes experience possible, its only legitimate application is to objects of experience. So that's how Schulze understands Kant's defense. And then when you reconstruct Kant's defense in that way, Schulze thinks you can see that Kant's reasoning goes wrong in a number of ways. So first and foremost, according to Schulze, Kant has smuggled the causal principle in to his defense of the causal principle. And he's smuggled it in, according to Schulze, in the assumption that synthetic a priori judgments must have a cause.
Right.
And according to Schulze, that just begs the whole question against Hume. Schulze also thinks that Kant's reasoning, as he reconstructs it, in defense of the causal principle is problematic in other respects beyond begging the question. So according to Schulze, Kant's defense of the causal principle assumes the legitimacy of another principle that Hume had called into doubt. So the principle that if we must represent things in a certain way, then they must in fact objectively be that way. And Schulze sees Kant utilizing that unjustified principle when Kant, according to Schulze, argues that because we must think that the cause of our synthetic a priori judgments is a faculty of the mind, it must in fact objectively be the case that a faculty of our mind is the cause of our synthetic a priori judgments. So again, Kant is helping himself to a principle that Hume has called into doubt in an attempt to answer Hume. And I'll just say one more problem that Kant identifies with, or that Schulze identifies with Kant's defense of the causal principle. In claiming, as Schulze thinks that Kant does, that a faculty of our mind is the cause of synthetic a priori principles, Kant is applying the category of causation beyond the boundaries of experience to our minds, which are not objects of experience. And
right.
so Kant is being, and this now sounds like Jacobi, Kant is being inconsistent with himself, right? Because in the course of defending the causal principle, Kant concluded that the causal principle was only valid for objects of experience, but now it looks like in claiming that faculty of our mind is a cause, he is applying the category of causation to our minds, understood as things in themselves. Yeah, so that's basically the core of Schulze's criticism of Kant's defense of the causal principle against Hume and why he thinks it doesn't work.
No, I think you did a fantastic job of really breaking down this question, or this the answer to this question. And these are great. So a lot of people, the viewers watching this, will get a really a firsthand experience of you kind of unpacking who Schulze is. So this is great.
Oh, good.
Um, so we talked about Reinhold before when you were talking about the Aenesidemus. And so my next question is, how did Schulze attempt to refute the principles that Reinhold put forward to defend Kant? And a question to you, does Schulze's refutation in the Aenesidemus succeed? And how important is this text in post-Kantian philosophy? So I guess there's like three separate questions there, or three sections to
Yep.
that. First, how did Schulze attempt to refute the principles that Reinhold put forward to defend Kant? Whether Schulze's refutation in the Aenesidemus succeeds, and how important this text is in the tradition of post-Kantian philosophy.
Right. So starting with the first part, so we got to, I guess, begin with, did you have a series you had on Karl Reinhold or somebody talk about him?
Well, so that's supposed to happen next week. So you
Oh no, putting the
feel
cart
free to.
before the horse here. Okay, well, I'll steal their thunder a little bit then.
All right.
Right. So, but I'll have to look forward to that episode. So just the quick thumbnail version of Reinhold is that he wants to have this ultimate first principle, and he wants to be able to derive from it all the other key claims in Kant's critical philosophy and clarify key terminology that Kant has in light of this principle. So Reinhold calls it the principle of consciousness. And the principle of consciousness is also kind of long-winded. It says, in consciousness, representation is distinguished through the subject and object and related to both. And an implication of this principle is that all representations are going to be of objects, and they're all going to have this kind of structure where there's a subject distinguishing itself from the object of the representation and the representation with the subject relating itself to both of these things. So now Schulze has got just like a barrage of criticisms. There's like a ton of them that he has against the principle of consciousness. So I won't try to go through them all, but just give some that I think are kind of representative. One criticism he makes is that he thinks it's not the highest principle after all, because the principle of consciousness is itself subject to the principle of non-contradiction, right? Because in order for it to be true, it has as a necessary condition that it not contradict with itself. And so it's not the highest principle. Schulze also points out that it's right, this principle is supposed to like clarify all of Kant's philosophy, but it seems to be itself really kind of mysterious and ambiguous. So he uses these terms, relating and distinguishing, and it's just not clear what exactly is meant by relating and distinguishing here. Like those terms can be understood in a variety of ways, and Reinhold doesn't do much to clarify. Another line of objection that Schulze has is to say that not all representations have this structure. So Reinhold thinks, for example, that, right, so Kant had talked about intuitions as, right, they were supposed to be immediate representations of objects. In an intuition, objects are immediately given to us. But then you might think, well, if it's an intuition and it's supposed to be an immediate representation, as immediate, there's no object that we distinguish from the intuition in ourselves. In intuition, we're supposed to be immediately related to an object prior to any explicit awareness of an object as something that stands over and apart from our representation and ourselves. And so it looks like this key kind of Kantian representation doesn't itself conform to this principle. It doesn't actually have this complex structure. There's a variety of counterexamples like that to the definition of representation that Reinhold thinks follows from this principle of consciousness. And I'll just mention one more criticism. So Reinhold's principle presents all consciousness as if it were a kind of object consciousness, right? So he's thinking about subject distinguishing a representation from itself and an object and relating itself to both. But it's not clear that self-consciousness has this structure, right? In self-consciousness, I'm supposed to be aware of myself. And if in trying to assimilate self-consciousness to object consciousness, as it's defined in the principle of consciousness, we'd have to say that in self-consciousness, I distinguish myself as subject from myself as object and relate myself to both. And it's not clear that that's coherent, much less that it accurately characterizes what's happening in the nature of self-consciousness. So another part of your question was whether Schulze succeeds in his criticisms against Reinhold. So there, I'd kind of distinguish two sub-questions. Right. So first, there's like whether in the court of philosophical opinion, right, in the court of public philosophical opinion, Schulze, won. And there I'd say, yeah, I think he did, because Reinhold's system died soon after the Aenesidemus was published. It had made a number of Reinhold's acolytes, like Fichte, see the need for major revision in Reinhold's system. Reinhold himself, ended up giving up his system, although parenthetical, not so much because of Aenesidemus's criticisms. Reinhold didn't seem to think very much of Aenesidemus's criticisms, but in any case, it was abandoned by the wayside, and it seemed like there was much more interest in Aenesidemus's criticism soon after than in trying to defend the version of Reinhold's elementar philosophie that he had given. So that's one half of the question about success. The other half of the question about success is whether or not Schulze's criticisms of Reinhold are actually good ones. And here I think you mentioned Frederick Beiser, who has an excellent treatment of these issues, as well as Fichte himself in his review. I think they're right to sort of take a middle path and say that some of Schulze's criticisms end up being good and hit their mark, but they're not all created equal. And some of the criticisms, both against Kant and against Reinhold, I think are not, they're not all equally good criticisms. But there are some legitimate criticisms there. And in terms of how influential it was, maybe it's important to note that even in the cases where Schulze's criticisms maybe aren't very good, so I for one, I think I'm like Fichte and like Beiser. I think, for instance, that Schulze has kind of misunderstood the way that Kant, for instance, is invoking faculties in his explanation of synthetic a priori judgments, and that it's just a mistake to assimilate that to a kind of causal reasoning. I mean, even in those cases where Schulze is kind of missing the point, I think even those criticisms end up being really, really helpful, because at least in Fichte's case, they force him to clarify, well, if that wasn't Kant's meaning, then exactly what did Kant mean? I think that was a really kind of important line of investigation that led figures like Fichte to put forward really powerful and interesting interpretations of Kant's philosophy in order to show that Schulze was misunderstanding him. Did that cover all the parts of the question?
Absolutely, you covered everything actually. So I thank you for your answer. My my last question to you, which is kind of a controversial question. I have specific academic friends that argue back and forth about this question, and they both have answers to. So I'm kind of asking a subjective question, I guess. Could we argue that Schulze's skepticism was in fact Pyrrhonian or Humean? Or do you think he's got or he just employs those within
Yeah.
his text?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So there's definitely these strands, like these Pyrrhonian moments and Humean moments, like we talked about earlier. Um, but as for whether at the end of the day, his kind of skepticism matches theirs, I'm inclined to say no. So some things that don't sound Pyrrhonian to me are certain dogmatic commitments that Schulze himself seems to hold. So Schulze seems to take it for granted dogmatically that there is a thing in itself, and then the question just becomes, whether or not we can know it. But that already sounds kind of dogmatic. And then there's other assumptions that he makes that sound both dogmatic and not superhuman to me. So he Schulze has this kind of Kantian view that all of our beliefs must sort of be able to withstand the free criticism of reason. And kind of related to that, he, I think, puts reason on this pedestal as the kind of, right, the ultimate sort of tribunal for belief. Um, and he also talks about what he calls the perfectibility of our reason, this idea that reason is continuously improving and removing errors from itself. And that, for me, that kind of confidence in reason as a capacity doesn't mesh for me with Pyrrhonian skepticism, nor does it mesh with I think Hume's low opinion of reason as a faculty. So you used the word eclectic earlier, and that I think is maybe the right word to describe Schulze's kind of view. Like, he's leveling these criticisms, but he tends to be kind of eclectic in his influences and in the criticisms that he makes, and ultimately doesn't fit neatly into any one philosophical tradition. There's a little bit of Kant, there's a little bit of Hume, there's a little bit of Aenesidemus and Pyrrhonian skepticism, there's a little bit of Jacobi, there's a little bit of Fichte, and they're all kind of mixed together in this unholy witch's brew.
I can't help but notice your shirt. It says "nicked," and I can't see the other word behind.
Nicht despektierlich gemeint. It's from it says podcast that I listen to.
Very
Called,
interesting.
yeah.
It's funny. It's funny because a friend of my last video was on Theodor Adorno, and the speaker that I was interviewing had a poster of Adorno. It says Adorno's not impressed. And
That's funny.
so today's video is great because you have this awesome shirt in the background.
Thank
Um,
you. Yeah,
so I can't
it's my
thank you
favorite
enough.
t-shirt.
I can't thank you enough for all of your answers and for participating in the series. But I just wanted to ask you a follow-up question, which is more in line with your own work. How did you come to uh, Schulze's philosophy, and how has it influenced your own reading in post-Kantian philosophy?
Yeah. So in terms of how I came to it, uh, my advisor Eric Watkins at the University of California, San Diego, taught this great seminar. I think it was 2006. Was on the sort of development of German idealism from Kant to Fichte, with maybe a little bit of Hegel in it. And so we ended up reading these figures, Reinhold and Schulze, and yeah, I mean, I really liked reading the Schulze at the time, and I also it also seemed to me, you mentioned sort of kind of how it's kind of maybe a relatively uncharted country. I mean, so on the one hand, there are these, nice treatments of Schulze, for instance, in Frederick Beiser's great book, The Fate of Reason. And there's discussions of Schulze by Brazil and other figures. But it seemed to me like I mean, for one thing, the work is long, and to my knowledge, it hasn't been translated in its entirety. And so that's a kind of opportunity, I think, for Anglo-American scholars to who know German to dig in and uh, question whether all the things that are said about, what Schulze is trying to do and the exact nature of his criticisms are correct. And so that was one reason why I think I wrote my term paper in that class on the Aenesidemus, and ended up, reading the entirety of the Aenesidemus in German, and kind of thinking that maybe there were certain parts of the narrative about exactly what Aenesidemus was criticizing Reinhold for, and exactly what Fichte thought was right and wrong about the Aenesidemus that could be questioned. And yeah, in terms of sort of, I don't know how it influences me today. I mentioned earlier that I think, I think it's, so I just taught a seminar not too long ago called Kant and Its Critics. And one of the things that we read was these sections from the Aenesidemus where he's criticizing Kant's response to Hume and giving this particular interpretation of what Kant's doing. I think those kinds of deep questions, these like metacritical questions about what the status of, Kant's transcendental psychological theorizing is, like exactly what sorts of entities those are, and exactly what sort of knowledge we can claim of them consistent with Kantian principles. I mean, I think that's a really, really important question, and not always, I think, um, uh, focused on as much as it should be. And and Schultz is somebody who kind of has it squarely in focus. And even though it seems like, his interpretation of what Kant is saying about those things is uncharitable, it can't be right, it really forces you to think about, well, then what's the positive interpretation of exactly what's going on with those kinds of claims. And so that's something that kind of keeps me up at night, and something where I feel like I haven't, to my own satisfaction, answered exactly, I don't know that I have quite exactly the right response that I would give to Schulze's ghost if it came before me, waving this book in front of my face and asking me to say what the status of those claims is.
See, now you have a great topic for an essay, Schulze's Ghost. I
Yeah,
like that
right. Yeah.
title.
Yeah.
Um, I want to thank you so much for being here and
Well,
for
thank you for inviting me and for the great questions. They were really thought provoking and got right into the heart of the matter. So I really appreciate that.
well, thank you very much, and for navigating us right through this very, complex thinker. And I hope when you complete your book on Kant, you'll come back and we can discuss your book here, and that would be great.
Yeah, I'd love that. That would be great.